When it comes to reopening schools, parents are sending mixed messages and from communities where COVID-19 has different rates of transmission. One response is the effort by the Massachusetts COVID-19 Response Alliance for schools to have more safeguards, even if that takes more time and funding. To explain is a member of the coalition, the executive director of the Mass Alliance, Jordan Berg Powers. Thank you very much for being with us, Jordan.
No problem.
Jordan, what about the guidance on what it takes for schools to reopen safely? What are your concerns there?
That they don't really have a way to be implemented, and they aren't actual guidelines that can help students and teachers and school districts plan. They're sort of a big wish list that are untethered from reality.
Well, talk about the reality because I know there are some communities in Massachusetts. It's almost like going to Finland. They have these transmission rates that are really, really low. Then I look at the city of Boston's latest figures from last week. In East Boston, I think the virus positive test rate was almost 9%. So how do you balance those two things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first problem is that there isn't a place in Massachusetts which is comparable in its rates to some of the places that are opening up. Even some of the low places still have transmission rates that'll probably alarm most parents. They would alarm me as a parent. So I think the first thing is that we're just not doing enough to control the virus. And in our rush to open back up, we really haven't done the things, even in Massachusetts, that we could be doing to make it safe for our kids to go back. On top of that, some of the students that they're saying need to go back first, or some of the students that they're most worried about sort of falling behind, and rightly so, are some of the very same parents that look like me. Right. So I suffer from asthma. I live in a poor part of Worcester. I have all of the environmental injustice that a lot of those parents have. I have the privilege that I have a job that allows me to work from home. Not everybody has that privilege. So you're going to put those students, those kids who already have all of the markers and are in families that are usually multi-generational, grandparents, aunts, and uncles. You're going to put them in place. And then on top of that, so you're compounding an already tragic scenario where we're also more likely to have the transmission.
Now, I know this seems like a familiar thing to you, but unpack that a little bit, because when a kid comes home from school, a kid who might never get seriously ill from COVID-19, that kid comes home, you get a multi-generation family. What could happen next?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that we worry about. One is they're going to go home usually to a parent who's been forced to be working this whole time, who's been considered, some form of indisposable to the system, but is disposable in terms of their wages and in terms of how they live their lives. So they're going to go home to somebody who looks like me, who has some of the same problems that I have. So I'm more likely to die from the virus than a white person who, in our communities. And so you're going to go into those homes. They're also going to be homes that are going to be older. They're more likely to have other sorts of environmental injustice in them. And you're likely to have a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle against somebody who's aged, who's also their age themselves, would make them more likely to have harm. And many of the students who we're saying have to go back because we're worried that they don't have access to the internet are in those households. And so we're sort of compounding the problem if we're incubating kids who are more likely to have COVID because of the communities they come from, and then we're putting them in classrooms where they're going to be with each other, and we're going to put them and we're not going to put them in buildings that are new, right? Some of the places with the lowest transmissions also have the nicest schools. They also have ventilation. They also have the things that are needed to be back in school safely. None of the places where these classes have those things.
What about the buildings? In Boston here, they have been taking some steps to make the buildings safer. Some windows have been adjusted. I don't know about the ventilation per se, but certainly people must have been aware there are problems to be looked at. How would you feel about the buildings?
I mean, it depends. I don't want to I don't know enough about the Boston schools. My child goes to the Worcester Public Schools, but I'll say that what I know about the Boston Public Schools is that they mirror the Worcester Public Schools and that they're very old and their ventilation systems need a lot of work. It's not enough for them to just put some window boxes in and hope for the best, right? This virus is aggressive. Transmission is really easy to happen. And so we need ventilation systems that are pulling air out and pulling air back in, as well as we need social distancing. These classrooms are too full. They were too full with kids. Classroom sizes were too big as is, and we're going to need smaller classroom sizes. So that means more teachers, right? Or more teachers per those classes, right? So I don't know where the money for those things are coming from. The building themselves, right? The ventilation systems, those all need it. We need also masks for the kids. Who's paying for that? Right. So the buildings are like one part of the smaller problem. But yeah, I mean, I would worry about my kid going into most of the schools that are built in the 1800s and the 1900s. I mean, some of these really ancient schools.
I can't vouch for the crowding in Worcester. I know in Boston they're talking about a plan where you have alternate attendance, so you don't have all the students going in any one school on a given day. Generally speaking, do you think that kind of way of grouping the students might help?
I mean, of course it'll help, but it's not it's just not realistic based on all of the problems that you've listed before, right? We have high transmission rates. We have classrooms. I mean, how many classrooms does that actually mean for kids? So many classrooms, so many buildings have only mechanical ventilation systems. And then just on top of that, how are we going to make sure the teachers are safe and the students are safe with PPE and the other things we know that they'll need? So it's certainly a step. It's certainly one of the things that we would have to do is think about alternative days or think about alternative schedules, right? Those are all things you would need to implement to be safe, but none of the other preconditions that you would want have been met.
Well, another condition that some people in Boston have been advancing is to have a pretty aggressive regimen of testing for students, that testing for the virus, that is.
Mhm.
What do you think we need to have?
Well, certainly, and I know the state has tried to do its part. Part of it has been hampered by the federal government's decision to pull back testing. We are one state, so I do, I think we all have, we're all concerned, right? We all want the federal government to do more, and we want our state to do more. But testing obviously needs to be more widely available. I know some people who have waited 4 hours for tests. That's obviously not feasible for a lot of people. So it needs to be readily available for the kids. There needs to be screening checks for all of the kids for sure. My guess is that the rate is much higher than we're reporting because we've done such a poor job as a nation, and certainly we've been hampered in our state with having tests. I know myself at least 2 or 3 people whose doctor suspected they had COVID, and they just didn't bother going to get a test because they were like, "We think you have it, just quarantine, and if you get sick, come in." Right? So there's how many of those cases are there? Even if anecdotally we know that there's a few.
Now, another question here is that we've talked about fixing things to make the buildings work better and make in-classroom education safer. But what if the alternative really is remote education? You want that to work better than it did earlier this year. So what would that take?
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I think a lot of the teachers who were on the press conference and call that we did, I learned from them a lot of the ways in which they themselves are thinking about and trying to prepare for that. And unfortunately, school districts have been left largely to themselves to figure out that. That's something that the state could and should have been leading on. There are experts that can really help teachers take what they do in the classrooms and bring them to remote learning. A kindergarten remote learning is not the same as a high school remote learning, right? They're going to be dramatically different. How long should a kid be in front of a screen? There seems to be an assumption that they'll just be in front of a screen like they're in a classroom, and that's not realistic. I wouldn't want that for my kids. So we need experts and we need guidance on those things. And instead, what the state has basically said is either outsource that to a charter school or figure it out on your own. But there hasn't been a coming together in the 6 to 8 months that we've been trying to figure all of this out. There's been time that you could have prepared for these things. You could have helped school districts figure that out, and that hasn't happened. And many of the teachers themselves are not brought into any of these discussions. They're completely left on their own to either figure it out for themselves or work with their school districts, or often not asked even by their school districts to figure it out. So I just think that this has been a real failure of imagination because there's been such a push to have kids in school. No one's asked the question, what if they're not in school? And we have totally squandered our time and to prepare teachers and students to make that happen successfully.
Lastly, I'm going to tax your imagination a little more, because if we had best possible plans, we would need money. So where would the money come from?
That's a great question. Billionaires have made billions of more dollars since this has happened. We know that there is a lot of money being made by the billionaires in Massachusetts, and they should be paying their fair share to make sure that we can pay for these things. So while you or I have really struggled to get by, while regular families have been counting on the extra $600, billionaires have been just adding more and more money to their pockets. We should be asking them to pay their fair share into taxes, and we can find the money there. We should be closing corporate loopholes, people who have been exploiting the system. Walmart for years has been really depending on the state to pay its workers, right? So it pays them so little that it depends on us to make up the difference. These are the sort of people we should be paying right now, while they're continuing to make more and more money. Walmart, like Amazon, has had an explosion of profits. Now is the time for them to be paying back what we've been doing for years, which is subsidizing their business models. And so I would say that there is money there. It's just a question of will. The state has to be serious about this. This is a simple math problem. We need things to make sure our kids can go to school safely. There is money being made by billionaires while the rest of us are suffering. We need to tax it so that we can make sure to pay for the things to make sure that we're all safe.